Hi there, welcome to this short introductory video for Campaign Manager 6. This video will cover some basic concepts. We're not going to get into any detailed technical tasks, but it is a great place to start for understanding the concepts around CM6. And once you've worked your way through this video, we'll look at some more task focus lessons. One of the first objects we come across in Campaign Manager is this thing called a domain. So a domain is actually just a container for all the assets in your digital signage network. Those assets will include things like projects and also all the other entities that help you manage your network, whether it's an audio or digital signage one. Commonly they consist of users. You would have a user account for different members of staff to be able to log in. You have roles, which help you control the permissions that different users have to different objects. Channels, something you broadcast to, and we'll get into that a little bit further into the demonstration. Players, which physically represent your the machines that you have connected to your network. A media library pretty much does what you think it does. It's simply a container for a media library that's stored on the server. Categories help you meta tag your media assets, and they also help you describe your other assets, whether they be physical assets such as screens or PCs, or indeed conceptual assets such as campaigns. And I know I'm throwing out a lot of new terms, but don't worry, we will cover each of them in due course. Control panel does for Campaign Manager what it does for Windows. It's a centralized location where you can control the way your system behaves. History then contains a list of all the actions that have occurred on your network over time. So what is a project? Well, a project is a container for items that you can manage all together. So if you had, for example, the task of managing 3 or 4 networks, it probably makes sense to use a project to differentiate between those 3 networks and be able to manage them separately. Projects contain media libraries, and media libraries really don't require a lot of explanation except to say that they are online storage for media assets. One of the advantages of media libraries is that you can create a user who has permission to them to be able to upload media. So if you have a company that is typically supplying you content for your network and you want to reduce the amount of work that's normally involved, often it includes things like having to log into FTP sites to download content, or receiving DVDs by courier or by mail, what you can do with CM6 is by giving access to the media library to your content suppliers, they can upload directly into your project and you can have access to that media there. And this dispenses with all of the usual work that goes along with getting media into your network. You needn't be concerned about the third party accessing other parts of your project. It's very easy to create a user whom when they log in, all they will see is a media library, so they can't delete anything, they can't see any of the other assets in your network. All they will see is a media library, and they can upload content there and then let you know when that upload is completed. Channels are an abstract item within Campaign Manager. So when you create a campaign, and we'll talk about campaigns in more detail shortly, but a campaign is like the unit of work. It consists of the media that you're going to push out in your network. But a channel represents a player or group of players, so that when publishing to channel A, the players subscribed or tuned, if you like, to channel A will receive that content and play it back out again. Machines that you connect to your digital signage network will appear inside Campaign Manager as players. So players represent physical devices, and it is through this entity that you're able to manage stuff like how much CPU that player is using, where it's physically located, what its specs are, what it's playing now. Playlists are also fairly simple items, and they're merely a collection of media that's going to play out either in a random or in a ordered manner. Users are simply the users who have access to your project and your domain, and users can have varying levels of permissions, and that's an important aspect of CM6 that we'll cover in more detail a bit later. But suffice to say that you can create users appropriate to the tasks that they need to perform. For example, you may have an administrative user whose responsibility is monitoring your network or even managing the permissions of other users. You may have users who have read-only access. You may have users whose tasks are very specialized, such as the media provider user, and you use users and permissions to manage who has access to your system. Schedules are the element of a campaign which determine when the campaign shows, and that could be as simple as 2 dates, play between June 1 and June 15, or it can be more complex where you have day parting and other types of schedules. History is a complete audit trail of every action that takes place in your domain. Okay, so let's talk about one of the more important elements within Campaign Manager, and indeed the element that as a user you will be interacting with mostly, and that is a campaign. So what is a campaign? Well, a campaign is simply your media, your schedule, and your destination information. So in other words, it is what, when, and where. So the what is going to consist of a bunch of media items. It could be a single video, it could be a collection of 50 slides that you need to show, anything at all. Really, it's the what element. The when is when you want it to show, and that consists, as we mentioned briefly in schedules just moments ago, it could be something that plays for a month or a week or just a day, or it could be more complex. It could be something that only plays on the weekend between 2 and 5. The where element is where that campaign is to play out. Sometimes you'll want to create a campaign that's going to run across all of your network, and sometimes you'll simply want to target a certain device, and that's the where question. So let's talk about channels. Well, a useful way of thinking about how channels work is to consider a radio station or a TV station. A radio station has a certain frequency, and it broadcasts content on that frequency, and any radio set that is within range and is tuned to that particular frequency will play back whatever's broadcast by the radio station. A channel is kind of the same thing. You create a channel within Campaign Manager, and everything that you publish to that channel will end up playing out on the players subscribed to that channel. So when I use the word subscribed, you can kind of think of the word tuned. You could have a bunch of players in your network all tuned to different channels, and that way you can publish different content to different channels. So when you create a new channel, you need to subscribe one or more players to that channel. So essentially it's simply like turning the dial on the radio. You're saying, this screen, I want you to play whatever I publish on this particular channel. There's often a one-to-one relationship between a player and a channel, but there can also be multiple players subscribed to the same channel. So how does the process work? Well, you start off with some media that you add to a campaign, and that campaign's where question, and going back here, remember we had the what, the when, and the where. In the where question, we choose which channel we're going to publish it to, and when we do all those three things and click publish, it will end up playing out on those players that are subscribed to that channel. Okay, so let's talk briefly about media libraries, what they are and what you can use them for. They're actually pretty simple objects, and they are essentially folders in which you can store media. Now that sounds very simple. You might say, well, why don't I just store media on my local drive? And of course you can do, but there are some benefits with using media libraries that are stored in the server or in the cloud. One of those benefits is simply dividing up your media assets into different types. For example, you may want to have high definition movies stored in one location, or flash files in another, or JPEGs in a third. Having media libraries also means that you can grant access to users who, as we referred to earlier, their role might be simply to upload media, and that is a way you can dispense with a lot of the toing and froing that's normally associated with the acceptance of media, whether it be through FTP. Another important advantage of using media libraries is that when large files are uploaded and need to be manipulated by colleagues in other locations, perhaps in another office, the use of a media library allows those remote users to manipulate this media. By that I mean adding it to campaigns or previewing it without actually downloading the entire file. If you look at this media library here, for example, this one is 8.2 gigabytes in size. When I upload this to my server, the users in other locations will start to see those files appear in their own projects as it gets uploaded. However, the media files aren't downloaded automatically to those remote locations, and instead those users can manipulate these files by using the thumbnails, which prevents unnecessary downloading of content, especially if you've got remote offices or you simply want to be more economical in your use of bandwidth. The final advantage we'll talk about with media libraries and Campaign Manager is that it provides a method for you to control the content that ends up on your website. Normally you would browse out to your computer and pick a folder or a network share where your media is stored. That is convenient, and you can still do that with CM6. What the media library allows you to do is to restrict the media being added to your network only to that media that's present in the media libraries. This is often used by persons that are managing for example, a franchise network. They want to be able to give the individual managers in their remote locations the freedom to choose what content goes up inside their store, but they also want to make sure that the media that goes up there has been pre-approved or pre-selected for inclusion on the network. This means that the remote users can select whatever files that exist already in the media library, but they are prevented from going out to the local disk and adding media that they may have created themselves and perhaps may not meet criteria associated with the usage of logos, etc. Okay, so we're most of the way through our short tour of the concepts around CM6. In the simplest term, a playlist is a list of media items which will play inside a campaign. So it's literally as simple as what you can see here. A playlist is a list of media items and their associated rules, which can be written directly into a campaign or created as a separate shareable playlist so it can be included in many campaigns. That may sound complex, but really at the end of the day all we're talking about is a list of media files. Shareable playlists are useful as they can be updated by users and automatically propagated to any of the campaigns that reference them. And that's a kind of a roundabout way of saying that it is possible to separate a playlist from a campaign, and your updating procedure can be as simple as changing the items in a list and clicking a button, and that would affect what plays out on the screen after publishing. Playlists are also useful when managing complex playback requirements. For example, you might want to play 3 specific items and then one item selected at random from another selection of items. It isn't necessary to get too deep into them. As I said, you can ignore them completely, but it is important to recognize what they do and have a basic understanding of what they might be used for. Okay, let's move on to players. Players, the term itself is perhaps a little bit distracting as it's such a generic term, but it really has quite a specific meaning within Campaign Manager. A player inside Campaign Manager is a representation of each endpoint or device stroke PC that you connect to your domain. You may remember when we were talking about channels, we noted that players are subscribed to channels, and it is important to maintain in your mind that difference that exists between channels and players. Channels are kind of like an abstract entity, whereas players are real entities, and they show up when you connect them to your system. So in your early experimentation with Campaign Manager, you are likely at some point to connect a player to it so you can actually do something useful, publish something to that player. And once that player starts to connect to the service, you will start to see it appear in the player's UI in the system. And this UI is really quite important when it comes to managing those connected players. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time and energy thinking about as we develop the product. But this part of the UI then shows us all of the players that are connecting to my domain. It really has some quite specific usages. It's to help you monitor your network for network outages. So for example, if a player were to become offline, this is where you would be notified of it, and this is where you can start your investigation as to why that player has gone offline. It also allows you to manage and collect data and metrics for your hardware assets. If you have 50 new players that have just been added to your digital signage network, how do you know, if you've never actually physically seen them, whether they are the right specification, whether they have the right amount of RAM, whether they're downloading at a speed that you find acceptable or were given to expect? All of that information is stored here in the player's UI, and it provides a window on all of the assets connected to your network. It is from this UI that we can see what a player is playing, how fast it's downloading, what time zone it's in, what version of the software it's running, where it's physically logging in from through GeoIP, and whether it's fully synced or not. You can even get a sneak preview of what's actually playing on that particular remote screen by clicking on the player and then looking at the details. We'll have a look at the players in a little more detail when we go and have a look at the application itself. Okay, we're nearly there. Second last item. What we're going to talk about now is users and roles. And bear in mind that this video is only focusing on those concepts within Campaign Manager that aren't immediately intuitive. For example, when I talk about users and roles, everybody really knows what a user and a role is with regard to computer software, but they do have specific meanings within Campaign Manager 6, and that's what we need to explore in this part of the video. So in order to access the system, you need to have a username and a password. So far, so normal. When a domain is created for the first time, there is a single user created automatically, and that user is called domain admin. And domain admin is simply the most powerful user within the domain, and they have access to everything within it. The idea is that if you're running a small domain, and perhaps it's only a single person operated network, you don't really need to go further than that. But the users and roles offers for those companies that are managing larger networks or require multiple input, it really creates the framework from which you can securely control who accesses the network and what they can do. I gave the example earlier about the user who is in a specified role called the media contributor. So that is an example of a user who has been granted very specific permissions so that they can get done what they need to do and they don't put their sticky fingers where you don't want them to be. It means that you can create users who are able to approve campaigns, able to publish campaigns. You may have other users who are simply limited to accessing reports. You may have other users who have completely read-only access to everything, and then you may have anything in between. The role system within Campaign Manager is very flexible. What we have done is created what we call role templates, and role templates are basic sets of permissions that are kind of grouped together, and you can apply to users just as a shortcut. An example of which would be what we call a power user, and a power user has access to pretty much everything inside the campaign and inside the project. The whole system has been designed to enable input from different types of users, and it isn't always appropriate for those users to have the same permissions, and that's where roles come in. Roles determine what a user can and cannot do. The last thing we'll talk about in terms of users, roles and security at this point in the introductory video is the system called Mate. What it means is that if you give out a username and a password to some user within your organization, you can restrict the use of that username and password to a single machine. This is quite important, and it illustrates an advantage that applications have over websites. If a username and password were to become compromised on a web-based system, that username can be used from anywhere to log in. The same isn't true with Campaign Manager. We can actually restrict the use of that username to a single machine. Well, we're nearly there. This is the last topic we're going to cover in our overview of Campaign Manager concepts. Publishing is a pretty common one, and whilst everyone understands what the word publishing means, it means something slightly different within Campaign Manager. And what I want to cover off here is just what happens when you actually click the publish button. During the normal course of events, when you're using Campaign Manager, in the background it is syncing against the service, whether that's a part of the Azure cloud or whether it's your own private server or from a service provider. When you publish, the content associated with the campaign that you're working on is put together and it's synchronized against the server. And what this means is that the server now has a copy of the campaign as last edited by you that is ready for distribution to the other players. This could be a single player, or it could be 1,000 or even 10,000. The synchronization occurs between the player and the server, just in pretty much the same way as it does between your Campaign Manager and your desktop on the server. In this case, the media will download if it isn't there already, and according to the settings that you've provided in your campaign, it will display at the appropriate time. As part of that sync process, information from the player is also returned via the server back to your desktop, and this means that we can check the progress of your campaign, we can tell whether it's been downloaded, whether there's a problem, and whether it's playing normally. And that's it. All of the other concepts within Campaign Manager are pretty straightforward. The reason we produced this video is that we're using common terms like publishing and campaign, but it isn't possible just upon hearing those words to understand exactly what is going on within Campaign Manager when we use those terms. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it wasn't too boring, and we hope you'll join us for the more technical videos that will come later in the series. Thanks.